Okay, off we go. Well, hello everyone, and welcome to today's event hosted by the U.S. Institute of Peace, entitled From Dissent to Democracy, The Promise and Perils of Civil Resistance Transitions. And this also happens to be the title of my colleague Jonathan Pinckney's new book, published by Oxford University Press, that we'll be discussing today. And we're really thrilled and grateful to have all of you joining us from around the world, and really are looking forward to a great and lively discussion. And just one note that you can follow this event live on Twitter with the hashtag #PeoplePower4Peace. That's #PeoplePower4Peace. And my name is Maria Stephan. I direct USIP's program on nonviolent action. And really, it's always a great day when a colleague publishes a book, particularly one that's really good and interesting. A wee story. I had the pleasure of first meeting Jonathan about 6 years ago when I was a practitioner at residence at the University of Denver, and he was writing his PhD. Erica introduced us, and I remember first being super excited to meet someone so passionate about data coding and clearly really good at it. And then over lunch, he was asking me such great questions about the relationship between civil resistance and democratization. And I remember not having very good answers to most of those questions. So fast forward a few years, we're now colleagues, and there is a book, which I know has been a labor of love for Jonathan and probably for his family and for his friends as well. So congratulations, Jonathan. And really the launch of this book and the discussion today could not be more timely. Nonviolent grassroots movements have historically been major drivers of social, political, and economic change, as ordinary people have used protests, strikes, boycotts, sit-ins, and hundreds of other methods of nonviolent action to resist oppression, advance justice, and hold governments accountable. And here in the US, in the wake of the broadest protests in US history with Black Lives Matter and the movement for Black Lives, we are mourning the loss of Representative John Lewis, who was a great champion of USIP and who dedicated his life to the struggle for justice, democracy, and peace, and was a fierce believer in the power of nonviolence and nonviolent action. In the US and around the world, there has been a spike in people power over the past few years, at the same time that we've been seeing a decline in the levels of democracy and a rise of authoritarianism. We know that while nonviolent movements themselves have democratizing effects, such as getting people involved in political action and balancing power in society, movements do not always lead to a smooth, stable transition to democracy following the departure of an authoritarian regime. Today, Jonathan will be explaining to us why some transitions driven by movements end in democracy, while others do not. And then we will have a broader discussion on civil resistance and democracy with our esteemed group of panelists, and followed up by a question and answer session with you all, where we'll be taking questions from you. And just a note on that, you all can type your questions using the chat feature, which is directly under the video player on the event page that you're on now. So we are really fortunate and grateful to have a truly remarkable group of panelists, civil resistance and social movements, experts, scholars, and practitioners who will help animate this morning's conversation. And I'll introduce them now. So Erica Chenoweth is the Berthold Beitz Professor in Human Rights and International Affairs at Harvard's Kennedy School. She has conducted extensive research focusing on political violence and its alternatives. She and I wrote a book together a few years ago and have certainly stayed in touch since that time. Erica has a forthcoming book called Civil Resistance: What Everyone Needs to Know. Zechariah Manpilly is the Marx Endowed Chair of International Affairs at the Marx School of Public and International Affairs at the City University of New York. He is an expert on the politics of both violent and nonviolent resistance. He is the author of Rebel Rulers, Insurgent Governance, and Civilian Life During War, and the co-author of Africa Uprising, Popular Protest and Political Change. Hardy Merriman is president and CEO of the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict, which focuses on how movements can build their effectiveness and win rights, freedom, and justice. He's worked in the field of civil resistance for over 15 years. And I would note that his organization, ICNC, has probably done more than any other organization I know of to advance the field of civil resistance. And for that, I think we're all very grateful. Huda Shafiq is a women's rights activist from Sudan with a decade of experience in women, peace, and security. Her work focuses on gender equality and social justice. Huda has held several posts in national and international organizations, including with the United Nations in Sudan and in the region. And she's currently Sudan's program director with Karama, which is a network of civil society groups and activists across Africa and the Arab world. And finally, Jonathan Pinckney is program officer and research lead for USIP's program on nonviolent action. He is an expert on nonviolent action, focusing on the intersection between nonviolent movements, democratization, and peace processes. And he's certainly a delightful colleague. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Jonathan.
Thank you so much, Maria, for that incredibly kind introduction. It is my extreme pleasure to be here today. I'm so grateful to all the people who are joining us here, and very much looking forward to being able to discuss this work that I've been engaged in for the last several years. If you'll give me just one moment, I will pull up a presentation. All right, thanks so much. As I was saying before, it's such a pleasure to be here. This is a topic that I have been thinking about and working on for quite some time. Versions of this work I've had discussions with almost everyone on this panel about, and it's very exciting to finally be able to share this final product with everyone. And so to begin this discussion, I wanted to go back to the moment where, in many cases, the inspiration for this book began. And that's right here in Tahrir Square, Cairo, February 11th of 2011. And of course, as many of you will remember, this is the moment at which Hosni Mubarak, the president of Egypt, stepped down from power after a 3-week massive uprising that was in many ways the peak of the 2011 Arab uprisings in the Middle East. And now, of course, this was this moment of incredible hope, where people around the world and in the region were optimistic that major political change could happen in a region that had resisted it for quite some time through nonviolent action. And this was supported, of course, because longstanding existing research had found that nonviolent resistance had this positive relationship with democratization, that when political change happened through nonviolent means, it was much more likely to democratize. But of course, what happened over the following years was that this moment of hope very quickly turned into moments of frustration as the transition failed to reach its goals, and then ultimately authoritarian backsliding and a return to a regime that was in some ways even more repressive than the regime that had come before it. So why did this happen? In particular, this is a crucial question to answer because we know that the uprisings of 2011 weren't the beginning of this kind of political change. Indeed, since World War II, there have been 78 political transitions that were initiated primarily through nonviolent resistance. And as you can see from the map here, these span every country of the world, every decade since then. And as I argue in the book, the pervasiveness of this phenomenon means that if we really want to understand the rise and decline of democracy in the post-war era, we really need to understand the impacts of nonviolent resistance on democratic progress. So this was the core question that I wanted to get at in this book. Why do successful nonviolent resistance campaigns sometimes lead to democracy, and why do they sometimes not? And in particular, I was very curious to know if there's anything that can be done about that. Are there factors that impact democratization in transitions brought about through nonviolent resistance that can be changed during the political dynamics of the transition itself? Or is democracy in these cases just something that's the result of long-standing economic or social trends that change only in timescales of decades or centuries. So how did I go about answering those questions? Well, first, I really wanted to dig in a very rigorous way to this question of whether that democratizing effect of nonviolent resistance actually obtained. So to do that, I did a series of statistical analyses of over 300 transitions of every type, comparing other kinds of transitions with transitions initiated through nonviolent resistance. Then, to answer this question of when nonviolent resistance leads to democracy and when it doesn't, I did some further statistical analysis comparing those 78 civil resistance transitions that I was talking about before. And then finally, did 3 most different case studies, talking with activists, political leaders, journalists, and others who were particularly familiar with 3 political transitions that have been initiated primarily through nonviolent resistance. The transition in Brazil in 1984, Zambia in 1991, and Nepal in 2006. So what did I find? Well, in answer to the first question, I would say that the findings from the work of Erica, Maria, and others on the democratizing advantages of civil resistance is indeed very real and very striking. As you can see here, a large majority of transitions that have nonviolent resistance as a key factor in their initiation end in at least a minimal level of democracy. Nearly 3 times more than transitions that are initiated through any other means. This is one of the most robust findings in the democratization literature out there. So what explains this 20% or so that failed to do so? The key question that I started the book with. Well, I argue that the key reason has to do with the uncertainty of the transition itself. While nonviolent resistance might incline a transition towards democracy, there is a great amount of uncertainty during the transitional period before a new regime becomes consolidated. In particular, I argue that in the context of a transition initiated through nonviolent resistance, there are 2 key challenges that systematically affect a country's chances of democratization. The first is the challenge of maintaining mobilization, continuing high levels of civic engagement and continued activism through the transitional period to hold new elites accountable and prevent backsliding by spoilers. And as an example, we can think about the transition in 2014 and 2015 in Burkina Faso, initiated through massive nonviolent resistance, but the protesters didn't simply go home once the transition started. Instead, they stayed mobilized, and thus when factions in the military attempted to derail the transition through a coup, there was a massive popular upswell that foiled the coup and kept that country's transition on track. The second challenge is to avoid maximalism. And this challenge is in many ways the mirror image of the first. A political action focused towards all or nothing maximalist extreme goals, rather than building up the new institutions that are necessary for democracy, can derail transitions and lead to no future consolidation. Instead, there's a crucial need for dialogue, moderation, and directing civic engagement into building new institutional channels. And one excellent example of this from recent history is the Nobel Peace Prize winning Tunisian National Dialogue Quartet that when the Tunisian transition was moving in a very maximalist direction, brought the various political forces to the table, focused political action towards the construction of a new constitution, and helped consolidate that country's transition. So that's my argument and some cases to potentially support it. But what kind of evidence is there to actually show that this is the case? Well, statistically speaking, there is a very clear correlation between high mobilization, low maximalism, and post-transition democracy. As you can see in the figure here, each one of these dots is an individual transition. The yellow transitions, the ones that end in democracy, cluster at very high levels of mobilization and very low levels of maximalism, while the non-democracies tend to cluster in the lower right-hand side with very high levels of maximalism and low levels of mobilization. So there's certainly a strong statistical relationship there. But what if this is just, random statistical noise attributable to something else? Well, in the 3 case studies where I had in-depth interviews with people who were involved in these transitions, I find very strong support for the role of mobilization and maximalism in democratization in these kinds of transitions. And just very briefly, in Nepal in 2006, there was a transition characterized by high levels of mobilization and high levels of maximalism that resulted in what I call a fractious semi-democracy. One where there's a lot of political action, but it tends to not lead to much institutional support and only low levels of democracy. The Zambian transition in 1991 was one characterized by low levels of mobilization and low levels of maximalism, and resulted in what I call an elite semi-democracy, one that was dominated by elites, many of whom were part of the old regime that was in power before the transition started. And finally, the transition in Brazil in the 1980s was one characterized by this combination that I argue is most conducive to democracy: high levels of mobilization and low levels of maximalism, resulting in for the most part, highly successful democratic transition. Of course, recent events in Brazil have maybe put Brazil's democracy in some level of threat. So I'll just emphasize this is about the transition in the 80s. And at that point, Brazil was one of the most robust democracies in Latin America. So to conclude, I do find indeed supporting the work of others that civil resistance is the most direct road from authoritarianism to democracy. And that addressing these 2 challenges, maintaining mobilization and avoiding maximalism, are key to staying on that road. And finally, I'll say, as I think any academic must when talking about their findings, that there is certainly much more to be learned here. My argument isn't that these are the only 2 things that matter in leading from nonviolent resistance to democracy. Indeed, there's much more out there and much more work to be done in understanding this crucial question of how we get from successful nonviolent resistance to the successful consolidation of democracy. Thank you so much once again for being here, and I'm very excited to begin the discussion with this excellent group of panelists.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Jonathan, for that short, sweet, and super meaty presentation. I'm now going to turn to our panelists to get their reactions, starting with Erica. So Erica, you've recently shown data that although nonviolent resistance is becoming increasingly common and movements seem to be on the rise globally, they're also becoming less successful in achieving their goals. So why is this, and what are the implications for the impact of nonviolent resistance on democracy, which is, of course, a central concern of Jonathan's book?
Yeah, thanks, Maria. And thanks so much, Jonathan, for that great presentation, for writing the book, for illuminating the topic so beautifully. I'm convinced by your argument, and I'm really grateful that this piece of great scholarship is now out in the world for others to learn from as well. So I want to reply quickly to Maria's question, but maybe later we can respond a little bit to some of the things that Jonathan brings up too. I think that the main reason why the incidence of nonviolent resistance is increasing is that it has been so visibly effective over the past 60 years on an increasing basis, and that knowledge is now more widely available to more people. The reason why I think it's been declining in its effectiveness is more related to the way that movements have started to manifest in more recent years, particularly around focus on street demonstrations rather than on building alternative institutions and other forms of non-cooperation that are maybe more time-consuming and difficult to build. I think this is related a little bit to modes of digital organizing, which tend to privilege short-term rapid response, rapid mobilization, and the ability to draw large numbers in a short amount of time, but without the ability to sort of build long-term organizational capacity for transformation and for negotiating the very difficult challenges that Jonathan has laid out with regard to essentially trying to create and invest in the new institutions while the mobilization is happening or even before mobilization starts. So I think that it's very much related to some of the issues that Jonathan brings up, not just with the post civil resistance campaign transition, but also how the campaigns are turning out in the sort of midst of mass mobilization.
Great, thanks very much, Erica. Turning to Zechariah, you have written about several waves of popular protests in Africa that have often failed to enact a formal democratic change, but have clearly played an important role in raising collective consciousness in those countries. So what would be your evaluation of some of the recent protest waves across the continent, such as in Sudan, Algeria, Zimbabwe, and the like? And are we likely to see formal institutional changes in these places?
Thank you for the question, and thank you for having me on this panel today. Like Erica, I think I really enjoyed Jonathan's books. It's a really nuanced and detailed account of, I think, some of the more complicated aspects of the connection between nonviolent protest movements and the kind of outcomes that we would like to see around democratization in particular. And I think I would sort of respond to the question by sort of tying it to some of the stuff that Jonathan is trying to do in his book, and maybe pointing to one of the sort of, I wouldn't say weaknesses, but maybe an area that you could take the research further in the future, which is that, a lot of these questions, as your map showed, have been debated very vigorously in the African context since the 1980s and 1990s. As your map sort of details, I would just guess that the plurality of such transitions that you're pointing to have occurred in the African context, as you sort of talk about, and as I think many people already know. There was a major upsurge of protest activity in Africa in the late 1980s and the early 1990s, one of which you talk about in the book, the Zambian case, which was part of that second wave. And these were a really extraordinary moment in which, at the start of this protest wave, only about 3 African countries were even remotely democratic in some form. And by the end of it, less than a decade later, you had more than 20 African countries that had democratized to some degree. And so that raises the question that I think Maria is getting at, which is, if Africa has already gone through this period of democratization in the 80s and 90s, then why would people be taking to the streets in such big numbers over the past, say, 5 to 10 years? Again, why protest if you already have achieved democracy? And actually, this is a question that a lot of African intellectuals were really debating strongly in the 1990s, because many of them felt that the nature of democracy that had come into being following these civil resistance campaigns was not democracy in any sort of recognizable sense as the rule of the people. That it had been reduced to a very institutional form of electoral competition, and that in particular, opposition parties, which had really benefited from these civil resistance campaigns, were not bringing about the kinds of transformative economic and political changes that had motivated people to go out into the streets in the first place. And so if you look at this literature, and here I'm thinking about people like Claude Ake, Ernest Wambadiya Wamba, who just recently passed, Ife Amadume, one of my favorites, Tandika Mkandawire, in the diaspora, Pearl Robinson, who was my undergraduate mentor. We're all really in the 90s creating this vibrant literature, debating precisely the question that I think Jonathan is putting forward today, which is, why do these massive uprisings that draw in huge numbers of people fail to bring about the types of institutional transformations that people are hoping for and expecting by putting themselves at risk by participating in these uprisings? And I think that in order to understand what has been happening in the African context, and I think perhaps globally over the past 5 to 10 years, gets at both a kind of conceptual and a methodological challenge of conducting these kind of studies over what is the meaning of democracy itself. And the book actually has a really nuanced discussion of this. As we know, most scholars rely very heavily on these types of data sets, the VDEM data set, which I think you use here, but there's many others, Freedom House and others, that tend to emphasize these very institutional dimensions of democratic transition. Really, the right to vote becomes the central indicator of whether a country has achieved something like democracy. And this goes against what you refer to as Robert Dahl's insights about substantive democracy. Right? What does democracy actually mean? Is democracy simply the right to vote? Or must we also think about democracy in relation to, say, other types of rights, like a right to assembly, a right to free speech, and potentially even more thornier rights, like economic rights, like a right to housing, or a right to employment. These are all aspects of the debate around democratization that unfolded in the 1990s in the African context that I think all of us globally need to start thinking about more seriously in this moment. Right? Because if we understand what has been happening, yes, there have been cases like Sudan where you have African protesters really challenging entrenched autocracies, but these protests have also been unfolding in countries like Malawi and Senegal, which actually had institutional democracy, suggesting that what these protests are about is not simply the presence of formal democracy, but also about the very meaning of democracy itself. And I think that's where we all collectively need to start thinking about how we can take on this question in this moment.
Great, thanks so much, Zechariah, and really helpful points on the importance of the substance of democracy. And Sudan, as we were discussing before the event, is just such a fascinating case study where you have a recent mass popular participatory nonviolent movement that has led to the ouster of longtime dictator Omar Bashir and is in this very delicate process of democratic transition right now. So I wanted to turn to Huda. Sudan has just such a rich history of citizen mobilization. So I wanted to just first ask you what you think were the main factors that enabled the movement to trigger a political transition last year, knowing that there had been a wave of protests and other kind of uprisings in Sudan previously. So what was it about last year that drove the transition? And what would you say has been the role of movement leaders and participants in that transition? And, maybe tying together some of the points Erica and Zechariah made, what would you say some of the challenges are right now for Sudan's transition and the challenges that the movement leaders are facing in this moment? So a lot of questions for you, Huda.
Yeah, yeah. So I think we can divide the reasons or the triggers that led to the change that happens throughout the last year into like a lot of experiences, like over years that of organized resistance that have been happening by like university students groups, women's groups, civil society, political parties, armed groups. So we have long history of organized resistance, but I think there are also set of immediate reasons that actually triggered that kind of mobilization that lasted for almost 7 months, which was the clear division that has been happening even within the ruling party and the issues of corruption that was coming on the surface, and the fact that they were practicing everything that they were denying the people to do so, in addition to the collapse in all like aspects, like economic collapse, social and security situation as well, that was going like deteriorating in a horrible way. So like, for example, with the economic situation, I mean, we saw the lines for everything. We had to line up for everything, for like breads in front of bakeries, for gas, for cash money, for everything. So the situation, the collapse of the government was just so obvious and visible to deny. And I think there are also some other lessons learned that we learned from the region, definitely, because when 2011 revolution started in the region, we had to 2013, and at the time we like to call it Habub, which is this unique sandstorm that Sudan is known about, and it came and it was very strong, but it was also faced with a lot of brutality and violence. But we also learned a lot from that experience. We learned that there is a need to not centralize the movement, and that was huge within the December revolution. It didn't start from Khartoum, it started from outside and it continued. There were also a very important aspect of political coordination, and we didn't have that as successful in 2013 as we had it in during starting from December. So having actually the pro-change forces from civil society and political parties and armed groups to be committed to non-violence movement, that was huge achievement. So having all of them agreeing to a minimum agenda, at least towards change, despite their ideological differences, that was also huge. And forming this alliance of forces of freedom and change, and having Sudanese Professional Association, SPA, as the new ambiguous leaders behind it, had also created a lot of trust between leadership and people. Because there's also a history of lack of trust between people and political parties for various reasons, but that created a trust, created leadership, but also because it was a joint planning for whatever nonviolent events that was happening, that also created local leadership, and it allowed the space for creativity, initiative, and it also allowed the space for new organization and structures within the neighborhood to come across the country. And this might sound not a big deal, but it was a big deal. Having something that's not centralized and is still and really boosted the movement and the mobilization to continue for like almost 7 months. That was huge. And but still, just not to run over my time, maybe I would jump to the challenges. I think there are many challenges that we're facing now, starting from the civil military type of government that we're having now, that not everyone is agreeing upon, of course. That is a very sensitive, let's say, agreement that the political leaders agreed to with the Transition Military Council, which is, I mean, very hard to balance. There's, of course, the economic situation that's still like having baby steps to improve the security situation as well. And the fact that members of the previous regime are still in many sensitive positions, let's say, and they're really organized, and they're mobilizing themselves and their members, trying to just having this transition to fail. So it's really critical situation that we're having right now. But the continuance of the mobilization, just referring to Jonathan's point, is really one of the keys points we're having now. And I would just conclude by referring to the 30th of June. I think the 30th of June was really one of the huge steps we had over the revolution, because after the massacre that happened in the sit-in and the lack of, and the cut of the complete cut of internet, having millions of people marching in the streets with all that, we expected a lot of violence and brutality to happen as well, but it succeeded. And I think that showed the power of the people, and it still became a very inspiring day and preparations we had for us to keep continuing in mobilizing.
Great. Well, thanks, Huda, for that really fantastic summary of the revolution itself and some of the challenges now during the transition period. So, one of the really key lessons from Jonathan's book is the importance of maintaining mobilization during the transition period. So I wanted to turn to Hardy. Hardy, from your work with movements all around the world, what would you say are some of the strategies that have helped movements maintain momentum and mobilization during critical transition periods?
Thanks, Maria. And I want to echo people's congratulations to Jonathan as well on his fantastic new book. On the question of sustaining mobilization, I think, we can look at long-term, sort of more strategic factors and short-term tactical factors that would contribute to this. And one longer-term factor that I think really matters is when movements set expectations with their supporters and participants that they're probably going to be in a multi-year struggle. And so, I think of the really helpful finding from the NAVCO data set that the average maximalist nonviolent campaign takes 3 years to conclude, and which means, of course, some take longer. Now, that's 3 years is remarkable. If you want to achieve major social, political, or economic change and you can do it in 3 years, that's fantastic. But if you're an activist in the middle of it, it can seem agonizingly long, particularly if your expectation is that you want to win within 3 months or 6 months. And so setting the expectation that you will be in a multi-year struggle most likely, and yes, this doesn't even include what happens after the topic of Jonathan's book. There's sort of a second phase, right? You've got to defeat what you're against and achieve what you're for. So you develop a long-term commitment in people. You set the expectation that this is not a sprint, but also a marathon. There will be moments of sprinting, but there will be moments where we regroup And when I work with activists around strategizing, one thing that unlocks the strategic imagination is when we get out of a 3 to 6 month time frame and start thinking about 2 or 3 years. If you think you have to win it all in 3 to 6 months, and to be sure, there could be circumstances where structurally that needs to happen. But if you have the liberty of thinking about longer time frames, your imagination, creativity, and strategy can start to flow because you can think in terms of phases and waves that are going to allow you, again, to regroup at critical times. I think another key factor would be making sure that a movement has a theory of how it's going to win, has a concept of how it's going to win. And this might seem abstract, but I think it's actually really important. So waging a nonviolent struggle can feel chaotic, can feel overwhelming. There's so many different things to react to. And if you have a theory of, well, this is going to take some time, but here are a few key things that we can identify and track that will show us if we're achieving our goal. Are we more unified now than we were a year ago? Do we have greater nonviolent discipline? How is our recruitment and training capacity? How's our participation look? It focuses you on those things, many of which you have some control over, and it frees you up to not necessarily have to react as much to your adversary, who could be pulling you in all kinds of directions and wearing you out. It also may get you out of going into cycles of protest, feeling like we have to keep protesting, we have to keep getting media attention, and if protest numbers or media attention drop off, which is inevitable, it always sort of wanes at some point, that's not an indicator necessarily that we're losing or that we need to kind of keep trying to keep that going. Participants may want to take another form, for example, in a boycott at that point. So I think having this theory and these key indicators of what you identify as your movement winning over time is really key. One last thing I'd say, just in terms of long-term, is movements are communities. They have to serve people's needs if they're going to last. And some of these needs could be economic, and you could have parallel institutions that serve people's, build economic self-reliance. But also social and psychological needs are really important. When I think about the US Civil Rights Movement or the United Farm Workers in the 1960s, they incorporated culture, they incorporated relationship building, they incorporated joy and creativity into their actions, into their meetings, into their events. And so you went, and whether you could be a frontline protester or not, there was something that could sustain you in that community and those relationships, and you could leave also with hope. It wasn't just politics, it was more than that. In the short term, tactical innovation is key. You have people who will want to give everything to the cause and have the time and risk willingness to do it. And they could be leaders and, do civil disobedience, but then coming up with different tiers of tactics for different levels of participation and risk tolerance is really critical. The person who has very little to give in terms of time may be able to participate in a consumer boycott or donate a room in their house for meetings. So lots of different ways for movements to do it, and thank you.
Great, thanks, Hardy. That was very well said. And maybe Huda, just given that Sudan's transition is in progress right now, on this question of maintaining mobilization, do you have any thoughts on how movements are thinking about this now in Sudan, how to maintain kind of mobilization momentum during this period?
Maybe two examples of what's already happening right now in Sudan is continuous activism and mobilization of the people through the resistance committees that were already established during the revolution, but they're still ongoing. Their work is still ongoing. So it's like neighborhood based and then across Sudan. And they communicate with each other, and they're really powerful structures now that they are very instrumental in like consultations, in like dialogue, in planning in general. So I see this mobilization as really one of the main support to the PM, for example, and the cabinet. They're not elected, the PM is not elected, but the political parties and the movements by the people, which are mostly led by resistance committees, have really been instrumental in just providing this power of people, which has always, what they always say is that protests are around the street. So if things didn't go as we all planned and owned and we did for like freedom, justice, and peace, we're always going to come back, and having them like active, that has been really powerful. But also that now there are new formed groups on neighborhood and communities based as well, which is called service groups, which is support the communities in the neighborhood with basic needs, as was just mentioned, like especially during the lockdown. So having like access to like gas and food and water, and just raising awareness, for example, about the COVID and all of that. So they're actually filling a gap until all these structures, especially on the local level, are well established and maintained, because it has been mostly, especially during the previous regime, controlled and dominated by people, members of previous regime. So this has been really kind of connecting communities with leadership and with decision makers. So there is no gap as it used to be. But we also, but also the movements and the political parties, civil society, and all of that, they're also working towards other important tactics that we need to assure, like continuous of consultations with people, for example, when it comes to constitution making or for the ongoing peace process. So because you need the ownership that people had for the revolution for other ongoing processes that's happening right now, and but also what is very important is how to make sure that we're reforming the institutions in a way that it's reflecting and responding to the people's needs, like the judiciary system and lawmaking and like budgets finalization, and the fact that in this transition we're going to have a legislative council that's not also elected, but still it's going to be the voices of the people. This is also one of the main lessons learned that we learned from previous transitions.
All right, thanks so much, Huda. Jonathan, you highlighted two main challenges in the book during transitions that can facilitate democracy. But of course, transitions are often nonlinear, they're complex processes and with many different important factors. So are there other things that your research has shown that help to facilitate democracy and transitions that are driven by nonviolent resistance?
Thanks, Maria. That's a great question, and I think there's a lot more work to be done here to get into a lot of these subtleties and complexities, as other members of this panel were bringing up. I think just a couple of things I'll highlight, both because they're sort of findings that have come up in my own research, as well as I think connecting to some of the points that were raised by Huda, by Zechariah, and others. So one thing that I found in other research relates to this question of maintaining mobilization through the creation of more long-standing, enduring resistance structures, similar to the resistance committees that Huda was talking about. So in some work that I've done with Charles Butcher and Jessica Braithwaite, we found that resistance movements that have the participation of organizations that have a reason for existence beyond simply the resistance campaign. So things like labor unions or religious organizations, other sort of day-to-day kind of groups, if they participate in resistance, then that's more likely to lead to more democracy over the long term. And I think it's exactly because these are organizations that have that longer term mindset that Hardy was talking about, or those long-standing mobilization structures that Huda was talking about. So I think that's one, that's sort of preliminary work at this point, but I think it's one really interesting factor to continue to be digging into, who is it exactly who is participating in nonviolent resistance, and how does that affect these longer term issues. And then I think the second thing I'll bring up is just related to the role of dialogue and negotiation processes in political transition. This is something that we're working on at USIP right now, looking at what does dialogue that can, say, move away from the kinds of maximalist mobilization that I talk about in the book. What do these kinds of processes actually look like? How do they come about? How do people who have been more accustomed to protesting on the streets come to the negotiation table and come to agreements that can establish new political institutions? That's something that's still sort of preliminary at this point, but I think one thing we're seeing is that the ability of having strong relationships that can facilitate these negotiation structures is something that's quite crucial for addressing that particular challenge. much more to dig into, but I will leave that question there.
Great, thanks, Jonathan. We actually already have questions pouring in from the audience. And just a reminder, you can use the chat function, which is right underneath the video player on the event page. So we already have a couple questions, and I might as well start to inject them right now into the conversation. One is very much related to what you were just talking about, how to go away from maximalism. So the question from the audience is, how does the maximalism mechanism work in practice? And why does it lead to failure? And how did you measure this variable? So that has your name written all over it, Jonathan.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think probably the most helpful way to answer it is to go into a particular case. So, the one where the case where I talk the most about maximalism in the book is the transition in Nepal that began in 2006 and lasted for several years thereafter. And what high levels of maximalism looked like in that particular case was basically anytime a new political change was sort of proposed for sort of what the new political system might look like, there was a move to basically shut down the country by anyone who happened to be opposed to it. And so there was sort of a back and forth movements that shut down the country anytime there was sort of a minor political shift one way or another, with very little room for compromise. And the result of this was, there were many different impacts of this. One of them is a sort of gradual loss of faith in the potential for democracy in terms of broad public opinion and within activists and political elites as well. Because they see that people see that no new political system is being established. The sort of needs that they wanted met through a new political system that go well beyond just institutional changes, also going to the kinds of economic and social changes that Zechariah was talking about are also not being met. And so that gradual loss of faith can lead to a desire in many cases for authoritarian return and open up a space for that to occur. So that's one particular avenue. And I would say two consequences. New institutions are very hard to establish, and there's spaces opened up for authoritarian backsliding. As far as how I measured the variable, I won't go into sort of the statistical nitty-gritty. It is basically, it's a combination of looking at sort of more extreme tactics, like general strikes or sort of comprehensive electoral boycotts, with also these sort of measures of the fragmentation of the political system between different political forces. And of course, there's a lot more in the book about that. Yeah, I think was that the scope of the question?
Yes, and there are just to be thinking about maybe for another round is the follow-up question was, well, what types of movements are actually able to move away from maximalism and what allows them to do so? So you can maybe think about that. But Erica, I know you had a particular question for Jonathan related to the book and its findings, so go for it.
Yeah, it's actually perfect timing because it's on this exact question, which is there's sort of a tension in the two processes that you're bringing up, right? If you want to have people maintain collective mobilization, but you want to move away from maximalism, it's much easier to maintain collective mobilization around what Mark Beisinger calls a negative coalition, right? Where it's like, we don't want XYZ or we want so-and-so to leave office. But it's easier slogans. We want justice. We want democracy. But during the transition itself, it's very hard to sort of translate that and maintain the same enthusiasm to slogans like we want ranked choice voting and we want proportional representation with 2 rounds of runoffs. There sort of is a mismatch between the types of institutionalization processes that have to happen and the level of enthusiasm often attached to that. It speaks a little bit to Zechariah's concern too about just like, what draws people into mobilization is values and what has to happen during the transition looks like basically institutionalization, elite politics, and another chance for power to be taken away from people, right? Even if it's taken away through representative democracy and quote unquote. So can you speak a little bit about in the cases where that mobilization was maintained, the enthusiasm around mobilization was maintained, even though it started to become a little bit more technocratic, and how leadership can sort of play a role in ensuring those things can maintain some connection to one another?
Yeah, for sure. Thanks so much, Erica. That's an excellent question, and I agree completely. These negative coalitional dynamics are so key to so many of these uprisings, and it is a real challenge to shift away from them. I think, again, I'll go back to one of the cases in the book, which is the transition in Brazil, where I think this shift was handled quite well by many different segments of the movement. So I recall in one of the interviews that's in that chapter, I was talking with a leader of the women's movement there, who talked about how they mobilized for a long time, both like leading up to the transition and then afterwards. And one thing that really struck me in how that person talked about their mobilization against Brazil's military regime was saying, we didn't see the ouster of the regime as an end in itself. We saw it as a means to an end. That our long-term goal was always gender equity. That's what we were fighting for. And the military regime was quite conservative on those lines and opposed to that goal. And so we mobilized against the military regime because they were an obstacle towards that longer term change. Not just because we hated the military regime. We did hate the military regime, but mobilized against them primarily because they were an obstacle to these longer term goals. And I think that was something, that's something that characterized many of the activists across many different contexts that I've talked to about this. That they see a longer term set of positive visions for the future that are motivating them, and they'll join those negative coalitions against a regime that is an obstacle to achieving that. But what's really driving them is this longer term vision, and that can keep people both focused on mobilization during the transition, as well as once the obstacle is gone, then they're still focused on those longer term institutional changes that they've always been interested in. So I think, again, that's certainly not the whole picture, but I do think that is sort of one important factor in meeting that.
Great, thanks, Jonathan. It just strikes me that this huge challenge of shifting away from negative coalition dynamics is just so fundamental. And it's also at the heart of the new research project that you're leading at USIP on people, power, peace processes, and democratization. So it's a really, really good question. The next question from the audience is for you, Huda. You talked about creating space for creativity and leadership at the local level, which seemed to be a key element of both the Hong Kong and Black Lives Matter protests as well. Can you talk a little bit more about creating that space?
Sure. I think it's, I would say it's very much related to the emerging of local leaders, and the fact that the design of this non-violence acts and protests were not an bottom approach, yet it was like most of the time bottom-up approach or just a joint planning. So just to give examples, is that at the beginning we had, and I'm sure you must know that we had our schedule of protests like published and announced at every start of a week, so that on like Sunday we're going to have a central protest, on like Thursday we're going to have a central protest. At the beginning that was it, and then when the local leadership and the neighborhood committees started to emerge, and they started saying, but no, maybe on Tuesday we can have a musical night in neighborhoods, maybe, and then the sector, and we think that we're ready, like the doctors union, for example, we're ready to start a strike, then that's it, let's have a strike. So it wasn't just like instructions. People came with ideas like strike, like using art, like just having night protests, which really exhausted the security people, because we had like acts going on all the time. So like day protest, night protest, strikes, using the art. And for example, we had a train full of people came all the way from one of the states in the north to Khartoum to the sit-in, and that was huge. It moved, and I think it took like one day because it kept stopping by different states in the way, bringing people. So I think the diversity, one of the reasons behind it was the diversity in Sudan also, and the eagerness and the ownership for the people made them use their instruments and the symbols of freedom that they have. And the fact that there were a lot of, that were like strong communication between these groups. And also the fact that they remained ambiguous the whole time until the step down of al-Bashir and the previous regime. So people would just be communicating. It doesn't matter who you are. It's just about security and it's about trust. And then you come with ideas, and that's it. It was by everyone. So I would say communication and ownership, and just providing local leaders with the tools and the support they need, and that's it.
Great, thanks very much, Huda. I think the next question is best targeted Zechariah and Hardy. And the question is there a role for Western democracies to support democratic transitions? Zechariah, you want to take a stab at that one?
Yeah, I'll try. I think, it's obviously a very important question politically. We know the United States and the West in general has played a role in democracy promotion, both for good and bad, for much of the past, say, 7 decades now. And so we really need to get it right if we're going to interfere in these countries' internal politics. We want to be sure that we're on the side of good, and I think good in this sense would be promoting democracy in a meaningful way, in a substantive way. And I think that the only way that that can happen, I think this is the great challenge, is that too much of how we think about our engagement with democratic movements abroad are sort of secondary or tertiary priorities in contrast to, say, economic or security policy. And so most of the time, and I think, Maria, you probably could answer this question as well as anyone, the desire for supporting democratic movements is legitimate, and I think at the individual level, very meaningful, but often gets trumped by other considerations. And we are too often, and I'm not here just referring to the United States, but also Europe, willing to put aside our interest in promoting democracy in favor of, say, economic agendas. This is a hugely, I think, fractious point in terms of our relations to African social movements in particular, many of which have been really centering the question of economics in their democratic action. And so can you reconcile, say, demands for greater economic redistribution, a reduction of inequality, with sort of the West's traditional support for free markets and capitalism? And of course, I think national security. I mean, if you look at much of the current protests in Africa, in places like Uganda, we have basically agreed that we will continue to support a long-running dictatorship in that country, one that has been very, very hostile to nonviolent movements, such as the one currently led by Bobi Wine, because the Ugandan military plays a very central role in our national security policy. And so too often, I think, with the West, and I think this actually fuels a tremendous degree of resentment amongst activists in these contexts, we have been willing to put aside our interest in promoting democracy in favor of these economic and security goals. And that opens us up to, I think, fair criticisms of hypocrisy, and in ways that I think will undermine our long-term credibility as a site of liberal democratic values.
All right, thanks very much, Zechariah. And Hardy, you've done a lot of thinking on this topic. Obviously, you've recently written a monograph with Peter Ackerman about the right to assist nonviolent campaigns and movements. And so curious about your thoughts on the role of Western democracies and beyond, and external actors maybe in general, in supporting democratic transitions.
Sure. I want to echo what Zechariah said, because I agree with it fully, and I thought they were great points. We have to get this question right. We really have to get this question right about how whether it's Western democracies or whether it's INGOs, can be better supporters of democracy, because with rising authoritarianism documented for over 10 years, depending on which measure you look at, 14 years more, it's leading us to a world that really no country is going to be immune to in terms of the implications of that and the propensity of the world becoming a more violent place. So we can all think of ways that it can be done wrong, right? How can we do it right? And for me, it starts with asking, okay, so if movements are one of the most significant drivers of democratic transitions, right? Incomplete as they may be, what then makes movements successful? It's not necessarily big grants, and it's not necessarily, it's probably, in fact, I'm sort of against the, like, throw a lot of money at a movement. I'm quite against that. I think that's a way that sometimes the government might think, and actually that can be destructive to movements. So my read of the growing body of research into movement success points to the fact that skills and strategic choices of movements make a big difference. And if that's the case, then shouldn't we think about how we can build better educational infrastructure so that activists can tap into the best insights they can find, the best insights available, whether it's from top scholarship like yours, Maria, or Eric, or Jonathan, or Zachary, or practitioners like Huda, who have great insights to offer from her experience. How can we build, as external parties, whether we're countries or INGOs, opportunities for activists to get access to the best insights they can from practitioners and scholars so they can build their skills, develop their own strategies, which are not imposed from the outside, and increase their chance of success? If we do that well, that will carry over into post-transition periods. So what we do pre-transition critically affects what will happen post-transition. They're deeply related. And I think, you know, post-transition, we have to understand that's not the time for people to just go home. External actors should not say, okay, thank you very much for your, you know, for your revolution. Please go home now. We'll just do the institution building. Corruption persists. The old regime doesn't disappear. In fact, if you want to look at alliances, suddenly they form a negative coalition against the new government because they feel threatened by it and want to get back in. And so there's a need for ongoing mobilization. There's a need for external actors to understand it. And the last thing I'll say, obviously go on, but I'll stop, is just the importance of incentivizing nonviolent discipline. The one thing that I feel comfortable as an outsider saying, it's okay to really draw a line here and impose it and not necessarily listen to the local need, would be if people start talking about the need to become violent, because there is so much data that shows that if people can remain nonviolent, there's no guarantee of success, but the prospects are better. And so that's a line that as an external actor, I think really should be held as much as possible, to not incentivize people possibly leaving the table and resorting to violent means.
Great, thanks very much, Hardy. The next question I think is for you, Jonathan, and Zechariah and others may have thoughts as well. But you mentioned that there are, as mentioned, there are several groups working on institutional democracy because it's easier to measure. How would you recommend that they shift to substantive democratic principles?
Yeah, this is a really fascinating question. I will offer a couple of thoughts, and then I will turn it over to Zechariah, because I think he will have some thoughts as well. I mean, so the first thing I would say is that I think in the last 10 years or so, there have been some really, I mean, fascinating from an academic perspective, as well as very helpful and practical efforts to gather data and clearly measure these more substantive dimensions of democracy. So Zechariah mentioned the Varieties of Democracy project, which I use some of their measures quite extensively in the book's research. They not only look at things like, you know, are there free and fair elections? Are there sort of these formal institutional measures, but have hundreds, even thousands of different measures of these other dimensions of democracy as well, getting into, you know, how much economic equality is there such that people can meaningfully participate in politics on a relatively equal status? How participatory are the institutions there? Do people from the grassroots actually have a voice in making political institutions beyond just, you know, does the formal right to vote exist? So I think, you know, thinking more critically and using these existing resources more strategically can be one way to get at this issue. And then next, I would also, I mean, just second, very briefly, I would really emphasize the crucial importance of listening to activists and others at the grassroots in these countries. That what, you know, substantive democracy or sort of a full-fledged political system that meets the needs and balances the voices of its people, you really have to to understand what that means in a particular context is going to be different from country to country. And really it's crucial to understand what that means for ordinary people within those particular contexts. Yeah, so those are a couple of things I would emphasize, but I'm very curious to hear Zechariah's thoughts.
Sure, I think for me, you know, one way to sort of start to push beyond our limitations currently in how we talk about democracy is to shift our thinking away from democracy as sort of an outcome or an endpoint, and to really think about democracy as a process. And this creates some fundamental tensions for those of us who are interested in measuring democracy globally, right? So I'm always very struck by how activists in particular think about these sorts of questions. You know, one of the things, if you participate in a protest, you'll always hear a very common slogan, this is what democracy looks like, this is what democracy looks like. And I think that's actually an important insight into how they are conceptualizing what democracy means. They're not saying, you know, let's measure the number of elections that have taken place in recent times and call that democracy. They're saying democracy begins when people take to the streets and demand a right to have a say in the political process. It's a very simple concept that I think a lot of activists insist is actually the correct way for us to conceptualize it. And this creates a tension, right? Because on one side, political scientists, we sort of look at a case like the United States and we'll say, okay, well, democracy is in retreat. You know, the Trump administration has implemented a lot of these kind of threats to democracy at an institutional level that we should be very, very concerned about. But I look at it and say, well, you know, it's also a period in which we've had the highest level of mobilization in US history. And so can we reconcile these two things? Is it that we are experiencing a massive shift to people power in a way that is literally unheard of in American history and potentially global history? Or is it that we are going through a democratic decline? And a lot of this is contingent on what we think democracy actually means. And so for me, I think as scholars, because we are social scientists and we like to measure things and we like to believe that we can aggregate these measurements into sort of convincing conclusions, I think we need to be a little bit more cautious and sort of temper that with insights from the activist community and say, hey, look, you know, for activists, you know, they have a fundamentally different conception of what democracy means. It is much more related to democracy as process, and that maybe we should, you know, not do away with our sort of institutional metrics, but start to pay more attention to these dimensions, right? I mean, I spent time in Sudan, you know, and I think one thing that was really extraordinary for me is watching sort of young people. This was like 2014 when the first wave of protests began in that country, who had lived their entire lives under Bashir, taking to the streets and realizing for the first time that it doesn't have to be this way, right? And again, this was in 2012, 2013, 2014. And by our metrics, those were failed protests, right? But I think that once that concept that, you know what, even if Bashir retains institutional power, he no longer retains power over our imaginations, right? It's almost impossible to capture empirically, but I think it is really hugely transformative. And so for me, the transition in Sudan really began during that period when, for the first time, as Huda mentioned, like, people started to imagine alternatives to Bashir. And so his time ended at that point, right? Not simply at the point that he actually steps down, but at the moment in which the people no longer believe that he is the sole font of power in that country. And I think that's a lesson that is really hard, but is one that we need to start to bring into our scholarship as well.
Those are really good points. Thanks very much, Zechariah. So we have just over 5 minutes left, and we'll try to get through as many of the remaining questions as possible, but there's a really big one here and a meaty one, and that's about repression. So the question is, can you speak about the level of capacity of the state and repression, and how does this all figure into the story about transitions? So maybe Erica, you want to take the first whack at that one?
Sure. I'm curious what Jonathan would say too, but I think that state capacity for repression figures into this to the degree to which the security forces are kind of aligned with or united with the incumbent. So if they are willing agents of repression, if police, military, internal security forces, paramilitaries are essentially capable of and willing to sustain repression over a long period without defecting, deserting, mutinying, or questioning whether that's a good idea in their own interests, it certainly can make it a much more difficult road for activists. In many contexts where security forces have remained kind of unflinchingly loyal to the regime, at least in mass, activists have often looked to different pillars of support like economic elites and business elites to try to shift their loyalties so that they don't have to openly confront security forces and therefore put themselves at risk. And an example of this would be in South Africa during the anti-apartheid regime, which very much, the anti-apartheid campaign, which very much kind of turned toward a strategy of dismantling the economic pillars of apartheid as opposed to the security pillars. But I would say that one of the issues that arises around repression is its propensity to backfire against nonviolent resistance movements. And in fact, many nonviolent resistance movements emerge precisely because of repressive episodes that alienate very large groups within the population that then mobilize against what they perceive to be a brutal injustice. And many movements get their start that way. And then when police meet those protesters with still more violence, the protest can begin, in fact, to call for maximalist claims like the removal of the regime rather than just the end of police brutality, for example. So this is a trend we see worldwide. And it doesn't mean that it's always the way it happens, but it's more likely to happen than not when there are incidents of repression against mass nonviolent resistance.
Great, thanks, Erica. Jonathan, did you have a quick rejoinder to that before we take the final question?
Yeah, I mean, I would just say I completely agree with what Erica brought up here. Those are all sort of really crucial points in the story of repression. I think just to re-emphasize something that Erica was talking about, the state capacity, and particularly the capacity of the state for repression, is not something that is fully outside of, like an outside force impinging on activists. This is something that changes over time and changes in response to particular strategies as well. That strategic actions by activists can change that loyalty of state security forces and change those repressive dynamics. So yeah, I would just add that to the points that Erica was making.
Great, thanks very much, Jonathan. So there were a lot of great questions. We got to most, but not all, but I want to end on this one because it's something we've been talking a lot about at USIP recently, and it's related to COVID and the pandemic. So the question is, can you all speak about sustaining mobilization during COVID, particularly when governments and armed actors alike are using the pandemic as an excuse to seize power, decrease civil liberties, and the like? So maybe we can get a couple folks' thoughts on that question before we wrap up.
I can just say one thing very quickly, which is that, I think movements have also used COVID as an opportunity to deepen the kinds of activities that they engage in. I'll point to something like Project South in Atlanta, Georgia, which was one of the first organizations, either governmental or non-governmental, to provide COVID testing in a state in which the governor literally denied the existence and seemed to be completely oblivious to how the virus is transmitted. So Project South, which is at the forefront of movement building in the US South, was able to pivot and actually provide those services in ways that deepen their relationships to local communities. We've seen similar things in the African context. The Congolese group Lucha, for example, also engaged in a variety of educational campaigns to sort of help people understand the significance of COVID in rural parts of that country. So, I think it is a very tough terrain for groups to navigate, but it also presents certain opportunities for them to expand their activities in ways that can actually deepen the substance of their actions.
Erica, did you have a point that you want to make?
Yeah, I just to to build on and kind of second Zechariah's point, I think one of the kind of inadvertent but important outcomes of this is the development of mutual aid associations, which have always existed but are now being supercharged. And that's exactly the type of organizational capacity that can help to create what Jonathan is talking about, because it creates more routine day-to-day interactions around real needs that are being expressed in people's neighborhoods and people's communities. And that does have the sort of procedural and substantive elements of social capital and democracy that that can help to solidify gains after a mass movement.
Great, thanks, Erica. Well, Jonathan, since we're celebrating your book launch today, I'll give you the last word if you want to address COVID or anything else that we've discussed this morning.
Thanks, Maria. Yeah, again, I would echo both what Zechariah and Erica said about movements' responses to COVID. I'm with a colleague, Miranda Rivers here at USIP. I'm just finishing up a paper that's done some survey research on movements' responses to COVID. And people are I would say, overwhelmingly optimistic. Activists see this as a challenge, but also as an opportunity to sort of expand their strategic toolkit, to pivot to meet needs in the ways that Zechariah was talking about, Erica was talking about, and I think as an opportunity to push for even more substantive long-term change than they were planning to before the pandemic.
Great, thanks so much, Jonathan. We are unfortunately at the bewitching hour, and so I wanted to thank everyone from around the world for tuning in this morning, this afternoon, this evening. I wanted to thank the panelists, Zechariah, Huda, Erica, Hardy, Jonathan, for their great remarks. Warm congratulations again to Jonathan for the publication of his book, From Dissent to Democracy. It's huge. And I particularly wanted to thank our AV team, Matt and George, for a fine job, as always, our PAC team, and in particular, Miranda Rivers, who on the Nonviolent Action side has been our lead in helping to organize this event. So thank you all. And again, thanks everyone for tuning in from around the world. And I'm wishing you a wonderful rest of your day.